They say every story has a beginning, but this one didn't. It was already waiting, rooted deep in the cracks of my memory, growing in the dark spaces between my thoughts, whispering my name long before I ever heard it. I thought I came here for answers. The old psychiatric hospital, swallowed by the forest and abandoned to time, was nothing more than another assignment, a crumbling monument to someone else's nightmares. I had written off the whispers, the shifting shadows, the cries of the desperate as folklore spun by the wind and shadows. I've spent my life chasing myths to prove they're just that. But now, standing at the edge of those rotted doors, I wasn't so sure. The air here was different. Thick, suffocating, like it had weight. It pressed against my chest and coiled around my throat, making each breath a conscious effort. I tried to tell myself it was just the scent of mildew and charred wood, but the hospital seemed to exhale when I stepped closer, its broken windows like watching eyes. The whispers started before I even crossed the threshold. Faint at first, like the distant hum of a radio just out of tune. I stopped, scanning the treeline, but there was no one there. Still, I felt it, a presence, unseen but undeniable, lingering just behind my shoulder. Then I heard it. My name. Elliot. A chill rippled through me. The sound wasn't harsh or guttural. It was soft, almost intimate, like someone was leaning in close, their lips brushing against my ear. I turned sharply, my flashlight cutting through the mist, but the forest was empty. I shook it off, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. It was almost funny, really me the skeptic, jumping at shadows. But the voice lingered, settling into the back of my mind like an echo I couldn't outrun. When I pushed the doors open, they groaned like something ancient and alive, the sound reverberating through the cavernous halls. The air inside was colder than it should have been, colder than the night outside. It wrapped around me, an unwelcome embrace, as if the building itself had been waiting for me. I told myself I was here to write a story, to uncover the truth about the hospital and its sordid past. But as I stepped into the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that the truth wasn't out there, hidden in these decaying walls. It was inside me, waiting to be found. The hospital sat like a corpse at the edge of the woods, its skeletal frame barely holding against time's relentless grip. Ivy strangled the broken bricks, and shards of glass clung to window frames like jagged teeth. The building had a presence, not just because of its size, but because it seemed aware of me. I parked my car under the shadow of a massive oak, its gnarled branches stretching out as if trying to stop me. With my flashlight in hand, and my bag slung over my shoulder, I hesitated. Not out of fear, of course. I'd done this sort of thing before, creeping into forgotten places, piecing together stories from dust and decay. But tonight, there was an unease that crawled beneath my skin, a cold itch I couldn't quite scratch. Stepping closer, I noticed the front doors were warped and splintered, the wood swollen from years of rain and neglect. A faint smell hit me then, a mix of mildew, soot, and something faintly metallic. The report said a fire had gutted the east wing decades ago. It still felt fresh, the air thick with an acrid tang that clung to my throat. When I pushed the doors open, they resisted, creaking in protest. The sound echoed down the long, empty corridor, and for a moment, I felt like I'd woken something up. Inside, the temperature dropped. It wasn't just the chill of the night or the absence of sunlight. It was deeper, an unnatural cold that sank into my bones. My breath fogged the air, and every sound seemed to stretch, distorted by the building's silence. I swept my flashlight across the entryway. Peeling wallpaper hung in jagged strips, exposing warped plaster. The floor was littered with debris, shattered tiles, broken furniture, remnants of a life long abandoned. A wheelchair sat toppled near the corner, its wheels frozen mid-turn. And then the whispers began. At first, they were faint, indistinct, like the wind playing tricks. But as I stepped further in, they sharpened. Not words exactly, but the cadence of speech, low and conspiratorial. I stopped and listened, my heart thudding louder than I cared to admit. The sound seemed to come from all around me, threading through the dark like invisible fingers. I shook it off, reminding myself why I was here. Stories like this didn't scare me, they fascinated me. Ghosts, curses, malevolent entities. People loved a good tale. But I was here to prove that this hospital was just a crumbling ruin. Nothing more. My flashlight caught a wall ahead, and I noticed graffiti scrawled in uneven, frantic strokes. At first, it looked like random shapes, but as I stepped closer, I realized they were words. Leave. Help. And then, scrawled in a larger, more jagged script. It's inside you. A shiver ran down my spine, but I dismissed it as someone's sick idea of a joke. I took a few photos for my notes, though the words felt heavier now, like they were carved into my mind rather than the wall. The corridor split ahead, one path leading deeper into darkness while the other opened into a room faintly illuminated by the moonlight streaming through a broken window. I chose the room. It was a waiting area, or at least it had been. The chairs were overturned, their upholstery rotted away, exposing rusted springs. Papers littered the floor, yellowed and brittle. A desk sat against the far wall, and behind it, a cabinet with its drawers pulled out, their contents scattered. As I approached the desk, something clattered in the corner, a sharp, metallic sound that snapped the air. My flashlight swung toward it, revealing nothing but shadows. The sound came again, this time closer. "Hello!" I called out, my voice steady despite the tension tightening my chest. The whispers returned, louder now, but still indistinct. They seemed to come from the very walls, seeping through the cracks. I stood frozen listening, until a cold draft swept past me, carrying with it the faint scent of burning wood. I turned back to the desk, telling myself I was being ridiculous. Pulling open the drawer, I found a faded journal. Its leather cover was scorched at the edges, and the pages inside were brittle, but still legible. The first entry I skimmed made my stomach tighten. The mind is a labyrinth, and shadows are its silent architects. What hides in the corners of our thoughts can be brought into the light. I have seen it. I whispered the words aloud, and the whispers around me seemed to pause, just for a moment, as if they were listening. Then the lights flickered. Not the flashlight in my hand, but the overhead bulbs, dormant for decades, suddenly buzzed and glowed weakly before sputtering out. And in that brief flash of light, I saw it. A shadow, darker than the rest, standing at the far end of the room. It didn't move, but I felt its gaze, cold and piercing, as if it could see through me. When the darkness returned, I was alone. At least, that's what I told myself. The first thing I noticed inside was the silence. Not the comforting kind, but the oppressive sort that swallows sound whole, leaving no space for your thoughts to settle. My boots crunched over shards of glass and broken tiles, each step an uninvited guest in the hospital's stifling stillness. My flashlight carved a narrow path through the gloom, illuminating fragments of a world long abandoned. Rusted gurneys lay toppled in the corners, the fabric of old wheelchairs frayed and rotting. The walls, painted once in sterile white, were now streaked with grime and graffiti, symbols and phrases etched by hands I hoped never to meet. It was colder than I had anticipated. The kind of cold that didn't just bite, it sank in, burrowed beneath your skin, and refused to leave. My breath misted faintly, catching the beam of my flashlight. That's when I saw it for the first time. The writing. At first, it seemed like ordinary graffiti, the kind left by kids looking for a thrill. But the longer I looked, the less sense it made. Words twisted and overlapped, tangled like vines growing in the wrong direction. Letters didn't just form words, they formed something else. Patterns. Shapes. My eyes started to ache as I tried to follow the lines, as though they moved when I wasn't looking. I shook my head and moved on, determined not to let my mind wander into superstition. I had a job to do, and I needed facts, not paranoia. But even as I forced my attention forward, I couldn't help but feel watched. It wasn't just the emptiness of the place, it was something deliberate, something sentient. The whispers started again, faint at first, like the rustle of wind through leaves. Only there was no wind, no leaves, just the stagnant air pressing against me like invisible hands. I froze, straining to listen. Elliot. This time, it wasn't just one voice. It was many, layered and distorted, like a choir that had forgotten how to sing in harmony. My heart thudded against my ribs as I swung the flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there. Just shadows stretched unnaturally long. their edges sharper than they had any right to be. I tried to speak, to challenge whatever was toying with me, but my throat was dry, my voice caught somewhere between disbelief and fear. I told myself it was the wind, the acoustics of the empty halls, anything that made sense. But even I didn't believe it anymore. Then I saw the journal. It was half buried under a collapsed shelf, its leather cover warped and blackened, as though it had barely escaped the fire that gutted this place. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The pages were brittle, stained with water and soot, but most of the writing was intact. The handwriting was tight and angular, almost aggressive in its precision. The name on the first page sent a shiver through me, Dr. Marcus Elric. I'd read about him before coming here. The genius psychiatrist who had turned into a monster, conducting unspeakable experiments on the patients he was supposed to help. The fire had ended his life, or so the stories went. But something about the journal made me feel like his presence lingered. Flipping through the pages, I found fragmented notes about shadow selves and trauma extraction. One line stood out, written in a shaky scrawl as though Elric had been rushed or panicked. The mind is a labyrinth, and shadows are its silent architects. The words lingered in my head long after I closed the book. I stuffed it into my bag and moved deeper into the hospital, telling myself I would examine it later. The whispers grew louder. They weren't just calling my name now, they were laughing, mocking. It sounded like my own voice, twisted and warped into something cruel. As I stepped into the next hallway, the beam of my flashlight caught something moving. A shadow peeled itself from the wall, its edges flickering like a broken film reel. I blinked, convinced my eyes were playing tricks, but it didn't disappear. It lingered, just at the edge of the light, watching me without eyes. I didn't run. I didn't scream. I just stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind racing for explanations. Then it shifted, darted, into the next room, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. My legs moved before my brain could catch up, carrying me after it. When I stepped into the room, it was gone. But something else was waiting. On the far wall, scrawled in the same twisted style as the graffiti outside, was a name I hadn't heard in years. A name I'd buried along with everything else I didn't want to remember. Lila, my sister. The flashlight trembled in my grip as I stared at the name. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse. It pressed against my ears, filling them with a low, pulsating hum that felt like it was coming from inside my head. I don't remember leaving that room. All I remember is the name, burned into my mind like a brand. Somewhere in the depths of the hospital, something was watching me, and it knew who I was. It knew my secrets. The hospital stretched before me like a living maze, its corridors curling into shadows too thick to penetrate. My flashlight's beam sliced through the darkness, revealing only fleeting glimpses, a rusted wheelchair, a shattered mirror, a handprint smeared across the wall. The air felt colder here, heavier, as if the walls themselves were breathing. The whispers had grown louder, shifting from faint murmurs to something more deliberate, almost conversational. I tried to focus on the logical explanations. Sound carries in strange ways through old buildings, I told myself. But deep down I knew better. They were calling to me, mocking me. Elliot, Elliot. My name echoed from somewhere deeper in the hospital. It wasn't my voice, yet it carried the same inflection, the same weight. I froze, my breath catching. The rational part of me wanted to turn back, to run, but my feet carried me forward, drawn by something I couldn't explain. The graffiti on the walls seemed to ripple as my light passed over it. Shapes and words emerged that hadn't been there moments before, jagged symbols and crude, childlike scrawls of faces twisted in agony. One word stood out, glowing faintly in the dim light. Lila, my sister's name. I stopped in my tracks, my pulse hammering in my ears. The letters looked fresh, as if someone had just written them. I reached out to touch the wall, half expecting the paint to be wet, but it was dry, cool, and unyielding under my fingers. This isn't real, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The silence that followed felt oppressive, as if the building was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. Suddenly, a sound cut through the stillness, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't coming from ahead or behind me, but seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I swept it across the corridor. Nothing. Just empty hallways stretching into endless darkness. The tapping grew louder, morphing into the sound of footsteps, deliberate and measured. They echoed unnaturally, as if the source was close yet impossibly far away. My throat tightened as I realized the sound was matching my own heartbeat, a sinister metronome counting down to something I didn't want to face. I tried to speak, to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. The flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I saw it, a figure standing at the end of the hall. It wasn't fully formed, more a suggestion of a shape, but it was unmistakably human. And it was watching me. I raised the flashlight again, but the figure was gone. The silence returned, deeper now, a void that pressed against my ears. I forced myself to move, each step an act of willpower. My legs felt heavy, as if the floor itself was trying to hold me in place. At the next turn, the corridor opened into a larger room. It was an office, or what was left of one. Papers littered the floor, most of them charred or water-stained. A desk sat in the corner, its surface warped and cracked. Against the far wall stood a filing cabinet, its drawers slightly ajar, the contents spilling out like entrails. I scanned the room, hoping to find something, anything, that would ground me in reality. Then my eyes fell on a folder lying open on the desk. The name on the tab made my stomach drop. Lila Grayson. I approached it cautiously, as if the file might vanish if I moved too quickly. My hands trembled as I picked it up, flipping through the yellowed pages. The words blurred together, but one phrase stood out. Patient admitted following acute psychological trauma. A wave of nausea hit me. My sister had been here. How had I not known? Why had no one told me? The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in as memories I didn't know I had began to surface. Her laughter, her small hand slipping out of mine, her voice calling my name. Elliot, the voice said again, but this time it was clearer, closer. It wasn't a memory. I spun around, the flashlight beam slicing through the room. Shadows danced on the walls, too many for the objects in the room to cast. They moved with intent, stretching and writhing like living things. One shadow broke away from the rest, elongating and solidifying until it took on a human form. It didn't have a face, just a dark, hollow void where features should have been, but it tilted its head as if studying me. "You left her," it said in a voice that wasn't quite mine but carried the same cadence. "You let her go." My legs buckled, and I dropped to my knees. The shadow stepped closer, its presence suffocating, its words burrowing into my mind. I wanted to scream, to deny it, but the truth had already taken root. I didn't mean to. I choked out, tears stinging my eyes. I didn't know. The shadow loomed over me, its hand reaching out. The room darkened, the walls dissolving into a void. And then, as quickly as it had come, it was gone. The silence returned, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of something watching, waiting. I clutched the file to my chest, my breaths ragged. The whispers resumed, louder now, blending into a cacophony of voices, each one clawing at the edges of my sanity. I wasn't alone in the hospital anymore, and whatever was here knew exactly who I was. The air was thicker here, heavier, as though the building itself had been holding its breath for decades and was now exhaling its secrets. My flashlight flickered, the beam faltering as I stepped into what looked like a records room. Shelves lined the walls, their contents spilled onto the floor. Folders, photographs, medical charts, all yellowed with age, their edges curling like withered leaves. I crouched to pick up a folder, brushing off the dust. The name scrawled across the top caught my eye. Patient number 47, Lila Grayson. My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe. The name stared back at me, as impossible as it was undeniable. My hands trembled as I opened the file, and there she was, her photograph clipped to the corner of the first page. My sister, Lila, 8 years old, her eyes wide with a mixture of innocence and unease. The words blurred as my vision swam, but a few phrases stood out, burning themselves into my mind, admitted for observation. Episodes of dissociation. Recommended isolation. I gripped the folder tighter, the paper crackling under my fingers. No, I whispered to the empty room. She wasn't here. She couldn't have been. But the folder didn't lie. Neither did the other fragments that began to piece themselves together in my mind. The memories I'd buried so deep they felt like someone else's life began to surface. I remembered the day she disappeared. We had been playing in the park, just the two of us. I'd left her for a moment too long, chasing after a ball that had rolled into the street. When I turned back, she was gone. The police said she'd been taken. I'd spent years convincing myself it wasn't my fault, that there was nothing I could have done. But this place, this file, told a different story. Lila hadn't been taken. She'd been left. My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps, faint but deliberate, coming from the hallway behind me. I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my grip, but there was nothing there. The beam swept over the doorway, illuminating only the dust motes swirling in the air. And then the whispers started again. Lila! It was her voice, soft and plaintive, echoing from somewhere deeper within the hospital. I dropped the folder and stumbled into the hallway, the sound pulling me forward like a hook buried deep in my chest. Lila! I called out, my voice cracking. Where are you? The hallway stretched before me, impossibly long, its walls narrowing and twisting as though the building were alive, reshaping itself to trap me. Doors lined the corridor, each one slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of shadows that moved just beyond the threshold. As I passed one door, I caught a glimpse of a child's silhouette, a girl with long, dark hair. My heart lurched. Lila! I ran toward her, but as I entered the room, it was empty. The only sound was my own ragged breathing, echoing off the peeling walls. The whispers grew louder now, overlapping, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Why did you leave me? One voice asked. You let her go, another accused. I clutched my head, the flashlight tumbling from my hand and clattering to the floor. The shadows in the room began to shift, taking shape, forming figures that loomed over me. One stepped forward, its face a distorted version of my sister's. You left me, it hissed, its voice a chilling blend of hers and something far darker. No, I choked out, backing away. I didn't mean to. The shadow advanced, its form rippling and twisting like smoke. You let it happen. You looked away. And now you've forgotten. I fell to my knees, clutching at the folder as if it were a lifeline. The truth was unbearable, but the shadows wouldn't let me hide from it. Memories came rushing back, clearer now. Her laughter, the way she'd tug at my sleeve when she wanted my attention, the sound of her voice calling my name. I'm sorry, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. I didn't mean to leave you. I didn't know. The shadows paused, their forms flickering, as if my words had disrupted their hold. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, angrier, filling the room until it felt like my skull would split. And then, just as suddenly as they began, they stopped. The room fell silent, the air thick with an unspoken threat. I picked up my flashlight, its beam weak but steady, and stumbled back into the hallway. The hospital felt different now, more alive, more dangerous. I wasn't just walking through its halls, I was being hunted. Ahead of me, the whispers returned, a single voice breaking through the silence. Come and see. And I had no choice but to follow. The door creaked open with a sound that felt alive, slicing through the suffocating silence like a blade. Beyond it lay the heart of the hospital, a cavernous treatment room bathed in a sickly, gray light that seemed to seep in from nowhere. My flashlight flickered as if struggling against the weight of the darkness here. The air was wrong. It wasn't just still, it resisted every breath, clawing at my lungs. The shadows on the walls weren't static anymore. They writhed and pulsed, shifting in ways that didn't match the beam of my light. And then I saw it. A figure stood in the center of the room, or perhaps it had always been there, waiting for me. It wasn't fully formed, not flesh, not solid. A silhouette of jagged edges and roiling darkness, its shape flickering and unstable. But it was unmistakable. It was me. The face, if it could be called that, was a twisted exaggeration of my own features. Hollow eyes that seemed to stretch too wide. A mouth frozen in a grin that split the face unnaturally. My breath hitched as it tilted its head, mimicking the way I often did when considering something. "You found me," it said in my voice, though distorted, like two voices layered atop one another, one too high, the other too low. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. "What are you?" It laughed, a brittle, unnatural sound. "Don't you know?" The shadows on the walls rippled, drawn toward it as if feeding its form. "I am what you've hidden, what you've buried. I am the truth." The journal's words flooded back to me. The shadow self, a reflection of guilt and fear, born from the mind's refusal to accept what it cannot face. "This isn't real," I muttered, taking a step back. "Isn't it?" it whispered, stepping closer. Its movements weren't fluid, they jolted, as though reality itself struggled to accommodate it. "Tell me, Elliot, do you still hear her? Lila's voice calling for you? Do you remember the way you left her?" "Stop," I said, my voice cracking. But it didn't stop. It surged forward, and suddenly the room was gone. I was back in the park, the day my sister disappeared. The shadows twisted into trees, the air filled with the faint sound of her laughter. "Elliot, push me higher." Her voice was so clear, so real, that my knees buckled. I stumbled forward, and there she was, Lila, her small hands gripping the chains of the swing, her face alight with joy. I tried to reach for her, but the moment I stepped closer, the scene shifted. The laughter turned to screams. The swing was empty now, swaying violently, and the sky above darkened. "You left her," the shadow's voice hissed from everywhere and nowhere. "You walked away, didn't you? Just for a moment. But it was enough." "No," I shouted. "It wasn't my fault. Wasn't it?" The figure emerged again, towering now, its grin stretching impossibly wide. "You let her go, and you've been running ever since. But you can't run from me." The shadows pressed in, cold and suffocating, dragging me to my knees. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, and for a moment, I thought it would crush me. But then I heard something else. A voice. Not the shadows, but my own, from somewhere deep within. "It wasn't my fault," I whispered, and as I said it, the words felt heavier, truer. I looked up at the shadow, meeting its hollow gaze. "It wasn't my fault." The grin faltered. "You're part of me," I continued, forcing myself to stand. My legs trembled, but I didn't look away. "You're my guilt, my fear, my anger. But you don't control me." The shadow recoiled, its edges fraying. The air grew colder, sharper, as it lashed out in desperation. But each blow was weaker than the last, and with every step I took toward it, its form grew less defined. By the time I stood in front of it, it was barely more than a smudge of darkness on the air. "You're part of me," I said again, softer this time. "But you're not all of me." With that, the shadow collapsed, unraveling like smoke caught in the wind. The room reappeared around me, silent now except for my own ragged breathing. The walls no longer moved, and the oppressive weight in the air was gone. I looked down at my hands, expecting to see blood or darkness, but they were steady. For the first time in years, I felt whole. But as I turned to leave, a flicker of movement caught my eye. On the far wall, my shadow lingered for just a moment longer than it should have. And though I told myself it was a trick of the light, I couldn't ignore the faint echo of its grin. The dawn was muted, its light pale and thin, as if even the sun hesitated to touch the cursed remnants of the hospital. My legs carried me out on instinct alone. My mind was fractured, thoughts spiraling and colliding like shards of broken glass. The journal was still in my hand, its pages stained with soot and time, its weight far heavier than paper and ink could explain. The door, which had refused to budge before, had opened without resistance this time, almost inviting me to leave. The air outside was sharp and cold, but it felt alive compared to the suffocating, dead atmosphere inside. Yet, as I stepped across the threshold, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't walking away alone. My footsteps crunched against the gravel path, a rhythm that should have been reassuring, but with every step, I felt a shadow trailing just behind me. I refused to look back. The hospital loomed at my back like a wound in the earth, its windows jagged and broken, its walls seeming to lean in as if they whispered to each other about me. For the first time, I allowed myself to exhale. It was shallow, shaky, as though my lungs were still uncertain whether they were free to fill with air again. The hospital, its shadows, its voices, all of it was behind me now. But the journal in my hand whispered otherwise. I stopped by the edge of the forest, the place where I had first hesitated to enter, and flipped open the journal, its cover cracked and flaking. The last entry I'd read, the one about the mind's labyrinth and the shadow self, had been scrawled in a meticulous, almost surgical hand. But now there was something new, written in jagged, frantic strokes. The shadows never leave, but we can learn to live with them. The words sent a cold shiver racing down my spine. I didn't write this, but I recognized the handwriting. It was mine. My chest tightened as I stared at the page. My thoughts raced, trying to piece together when, how, or why this had appeared. I ran my fingers over the ink. It was dry, but it hadn't been there before. The shadows weren't finished with me. A crow cawed somewhere above me, its voice sharp and grating, cutting through the oppressive silence. The sound jolted me into movement. I snapped the journal shut and shoved it into my bag, unwilling to look at it anymore. Not here. I glanced back at the hospital for what I told myself would be the last time. In the fractured light of the early morning, it looked almost peaceful, its edges softened by mist. But then, in one of the jagged windows, I saw it. A figure stood there, motionless. Its form was indistinct, a silhouette carved from darkness, but I knew its shape as well as my own. It wasn't watching me leave, it was waiting. I felt the air thicken, the weight of its gaze pressing against me. My heart hammered in my chest, but I didn't run. I didn't move. I just stared back, unwilling to let it follow me into the waking world. The figure didn't move, but it didn't need to. Its presence lingered, a reminder that the shadows had claimed a part of me, just as they had claimed the hospital. Finally, I forced myself to turn away and step into the forest, the trees closing in around me like sentinels. My footsteps were deliberate, measured, but I felt lighter somehow, even as the journal weighed against my back. The hospital hadn't beaten me, not entirely. The shadows were there, yes, but they hadn't consumed me. Instead, they'd left me with a truth I couldn't unlearn. We all have shadows, lurking in the corners of our minds, whispering doubts and fears. We can't escape them, but maybe we can live with them. As the forest thinned and the first hints of civilization came into view, I felt a strange, unexpected calm. The sun, still hesitant, began to climb higher, and for the first time in hours, warmth touched my skin. I reached for my recorder, wanting to capture the moment, but when I clicked it on, it began to play on its own. The static buzzed briefly before my voice spoke. "I'm still here." I froze, staring at the device as the sound cut out. My reflection in the screen stared back at me, fractured and distorted. Without a word, I turned it off and slipped it into my pocket. The shadows never leave, but I would keep walking anyway. It's been 3 months since I left the hospital. 3 months of trying to piece my life back together. The world outside its decaying walls should feel brighter, safer, but it doesn't. The shadows have followed me, though not in the way I expected. They're not lurking in corners or trailing me in darkened hallways. Instead, they're quieter, subtler, whispering in the spaces between my thoughts. I returned to my apartment that morning, exhausted but alive. The journal sat on my desk for weeks, untouched, its weight a reminder of the truths I uncovered. I wanted to throw it away, burn it, bury it somewhere it couldn't find me again, but I couldn't. It felt wrong to destroy it, like erasing part of myself. I've started writing again, though the words don't come as easily as they used to. My articles lack the sharpness they once had, and my editor has noticed. "You're distracted," she says. She's right, but I can't explain why. The recorder sits on the same shelf as the journal. I haven't played it since that day in the forest, though I feel its presence every time I walk past. It's a silent reminder that the shadows are never truly gone. Last night, I woke up to the sound of static. The recorder had turned itself on again, its faint hum filling the room. I stayed in bed, my heart pounding, staring at it from across the room. When I finally summoned the courage to approach, the screen was blank. No recording, no message, just silence. But silence has weight, and this silence was heavy. I've started seeing her again, Lila. Not as she was, but as the shadows showed her to me in the hospital. A flash of her face in the corner of a mirror. The sound of her laughter in the middle of the night. Too faint and too familiar. I know she's not really there. At least, I think I know. Some nights, I hear Dr. Elric's voice, faint and distant, repeating those haunting words. The mind is a labyrinth. I wonder if he's right, if I'm still trapped in the halls of that hospital, wandering its endless corridors, unable to escape the maze of my own mind. But I keep moving forward. I get out of bed every morning. I go to work. I tell myself the shadows don't control me. And yet there are moments when the room is too quiet, when my reflection looks just a little off, when I feel them pressing in. The journal's final message echoes in my mind. The shadows never leave, but we can learn to live with them. I'm trying to believe that. Tonight, as I sit here writing this, the air feels different. The silence is back, heavier than ever, and the shadows on the walls seem just a little darker. My reflection in the window is still, but I'm not. I tell myself it's just my imagination, just a trick of the light. But deep down I know better. The shadows don't leave. They're always waiting, just beneath the surface, watching, whispering, and waiting for their moment to return. And when they do, I'll be ready. I hope so.